The fluorescent glow of the shopping mall after closing with lights still on cast long, skeletal shadows across the polished floor. My footsteps, usually muffled by the daytime din, echoed with an almost aggressive clarity, each click and scuff a precise punctuation in the vast, hushed emptiness. The air, conditioned to a perpetual, cool neutrality, carried a faint, mingled scent of stale popcorn and disinfectant, a testament to the day's vanished crowds. My small cartography workshop, tucked away on the third level, was an island of focused light amidst the silent storefronts, its glass frontage reflecting the ghostly, illuminated void of the central atrium. I stood over my drafting table, the warm, steady beam of my lamp illuminating the intricate lines of a 17th century coastal chart. My fingers, stained faintly with ink, traced the familiar contours of a forgotten shoreline, the parchment cool beneath my touch. This was my solace, my calling, to render the world, both lost and present, with an accuracy that bordered on reverence. Yet, even as I meticulously cross-referenced a Portuguese logbook, my thoughts drifted, a persistent current beneath the calm surface of my concentration. The estate. Its name, whispered in a solicitor's dry office, felt less like an inheritance and more like a summons. A remote, decaying ancestral home, nestled deep within a forgotten corner of the countryside, bequeathed to me, the last of the line. I had never seen it, only photographs, crumbling stone, ivy-choked walls, a roofline that sagged like a weary brow. A place of deep, unyielding quiet, far from the sterile hum of this mall. My current project, a labor of love, suddenly felt distant, a meticulous distraction from the looming shadow of my family's past. I had driven for hours, the landscape gradually shedding its manicured edges, giving way to a wilder, more untamed expanse. The scent of damp earth and ancient trees had seeped into the car, replacing the urban exhaust. When I finally saw the estate, silhouetted against a bruised twilight sky, it was exactly as the photographs depicted, yet infinitely more imposing. A sentinel of forgotten time, breathing its own slow, musty breath. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of dust and decay, a pungent perfume of generations. The floorboards groaned under my weight, a chorus of protest against my intrusion. I moved through the echoing chambers, each filled with the ghosts of forgotten lives, their possessions shrouded in white sheets like slumbering phantoms. It was in the study, a room lined with water-stained books and a desk scarred by countless years, that I found it. Beneath a pile of yellowed ledgers, nestled within a leather-bound folio, lay the map. Not a grand, rolled chart, but a folded, heavy piece of vellum, brittle with age. My cartographer's eye immediately registered its anomaly. It depicted the estate, yes, with a startling level of detail, the winding path to the main house, the precise placement of the ancient oak grove, the meandering stream that bisected the property. The scale was impeccable, the hand that drew it clearly skilled, perhaps even masterly. But then, the oddities began. Beyond the familiar boundaries, where the estate's land met the encroaching wilderness, the map abruptly ceased. It simply ended, as if the cartographer had stopped mid-stroke, or as if the world beyond that point was unknowable, or perhaps, deliberately unmapped. And within the depicted area, scattered amongst the mundane features, were symbols I did not recognize. Intricate, angular glyphs, resembling no script I had ever encountered, adorned sections of the land, particularly around the stream and beneath the old oak grove. Some were small, almost imperceptible, while others were bold, etched with a deeper, more insistent hand. One symbol, a twisted, barbed spiral, seemed to pulse with a faint, unsettling energy, even through the faded ink. My professional curiosity, usually a calm and rational force, stirred with an unfamiliar tremor. This wasn't merely an incomplete historical document, it felt like a puzzle with missing pieces, each absence hinting at a presence. The precision of the known elements made the inexplicable ones all the more jarring, a discordant note in a meticulously composed symphony. I ran a fingertip over the vellum, feeling the raised texture of the ink, the subtle undulations of the ancient paper. I knew, with a certainty that prickled my skin, that I had to complete it. The estate had offered me not just a home, but a mystery, and I, Reed, the cartographer of lost worlds, felt an undeniable pull towards its unsettling depths. The cart, laden with provisions for a protracted stay, rumbled a hollow counterpoint to my unease. I had secured everything necessary, from sturdy boots to a high-resolution drone, tools for an exploration far more demanding than I had initially anticipated. The heavy glass doors sighed open, releasing me into the damp embrace of the pre-dawn air. The journey to the estate was a winding descent into an older, less forgiving landscape. Paved roads dissolved into gravel, then into little more than twin ruts choked with tenacious weeds. The air grew thicker, cooler, carrying the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, a primal perfume that clung to the vehicle's vents. The signal on my communication device flickered, then died, severing the last thread to the world I knew. This was it, the Ancestral lands, a name whispered in hushed tones during my infrequent family gatherings, always accompanied by a peculiar tightening around the eyes of the elder relatives. When the estate finally emerged from the low-slung mist, it was not with a grand reveal, but a slow, grudging materialization. The sheer scale of the neglect was staggering. Ivy, thick as a man's arm, wrestled with the stone, and ancient oaks, their branches gnarled like arthritic fingers, clawed at the slate roof. Inside, the inherited map lay spread across a dust-shrouded table in what I assumed was once a study. Its parchment, brittle and smelling faintly of dried herbs and forgotten ink, absorbed the beam of my headlamp. The familiar, meticulous lines of my own craft were absent here. Instead, a series of crude, yet strangely precise, markings depicted the estate's boundaries, its main structures, and then, a startling array of features I had never encountered in any modern survey. My cartographer's heart quickened, not with excitement, but with a prickle of unease. The first day was spent mapping the immediate vicinity of the main house, cross-referencing the ancient document with the physical reality. My GPS unit, usually a beacon of accuracy, seemed to struggle here, its readings occasionally drifting, as if the very ground beneath me possessed a subtle magnetic anomaly. What the old map marked as a simple copse of pines was indeed there, but nestled within its depths, half swallowed by thorns and moss, was a crumbling stone edifice, no larger than a woodshed, yet clearly not a part of any existing deed. Its stones were laid with an archaic precision, and no door or window broke its seamless, weathered face. As I pushed deeper, guided by the map's cryptic symbols, the discrepancies multiplied. The terrain became a labyrinth of overgrown paths that didn't appear on any contemporary record. Then came the markers. Scattered at irregular intervals, usually half buried in the soil, were rough-hewn stones. They were too large to be simple boundary markers, too uniform in their lack of discernible pattern to be accidental. Each one stood perhaps a foot or two above the earth, its surface worn smooth by untold seasons, yet their placement seemed deliberate, almost ritualistic. One, particularly large and squat, stood at the confluence of three almost invisible paths, its top surface strangely flat, as if meant for some purpose. The air itself began to shift. And the sounds. Oh, the sounds. Not the familiar chirps of unseen birds or the rustle of small creatures. These were deeper, more resonant. A faint, almost imperceptible groan that seemed to rise from the earth itself. A prolonged sigh carried on the wind, too low to pinpoint, too pervasive to ignore. My cartographer's instruments, usually my anchors in the material world, seemed inadequate here, unable to capture the subtle, insidious strangeness that permeated the very fabric of this forgotten land. The methodical precision I cherished was being eroded, replaced by a growing, formless apprehension. I was no longer merely charting land, I was charting something else entirely, something ancient and deeply unsettling. The air, typically a cacophony of commerce, now held a sterile chill, the faint, metallic scent of floor wax clinging to my nostrils. I pushed my cart, laden with the practical necessities of a solitary life in an ancestral house, sturdy work gloves, rolls of heavy-duty tarp, a new, more powerful lamp for the cellar. My gaze, habitually fixed on the precise alignment of tiles, flickered. A movement, quick and indistinct, at the very edge of my vision. A ripple in the stagnant air, perhaps, or a trick of the stark overhead lighting. Nothing. Only the vacant storefronts, their displays frozen in a silent plea for attention. My logical mind, honed by years of mapping forgotten territories, dismissed it as fatigue, a retinal afterimage. Yet, a subtle prickle, like static electricity before a storm, traced its way up my spine. I quickened my pace, eager to leave the cavernous, unnatural quiet behind. Back at the estate, the silence was different. I set about unpacking, my movements precise, methodical. Each item had its place, a small victory of order against the encroaching disarray of the old building. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly, in the periphery of my awareness. Not words, not quite. More a texture of sound, a breath exhaled into the stillness. I would stop, head cocked, listening intently, but the sound would vanish, leaving only the creak of the house settling, the distant murmur of the wind through the eaves. The old house is talking to itself, I'd tell myself, a wry smile failing to quite reach my eyes. Just the drafts playing tricks in these cavernous rooms. Then came the rearrangement of objects. A specific drafting pencil, one I'd left precisely beside my compass on the large oak table in the study, would be found hours later near the window, as if someone had idly carried it there. A stack of old journals, which I had carefully aligned by size, would appear askew, a single volume nudged forward from the rest. I, a man whose entire profession revolved around precision and order, found myself increasingly frustrated. Was I so preoccupied that my own meticulous habits were failing me? I began to make mental notes, then actual notes, of where I left things, a silent challenge to my own perceived absent-mindedness. Each time an item was disturbed, a faint tremor of unease would ripple beneath my professional composure. The nights, however, offered no such rationalizations. They became a descent into a landscape of vivid, unsettling nightmares. I found myself adrift in a labyrinth of tunnels beneath the estate, the air thick with the smell of wet earth and something else, something metallic and acrid. Faceless forms would move just beyond the reach of my vision, their presence a crushing weight. These were not the fleeting anxieties of a tired mind, they were precise, visceral experiences that gnawed at the edges of my waking hours. I'd sit up in bed, the moon's pale light painting the room in shades of gray, and listen. Always listening. The house, it seemed, listened back. My focus, my anchor, remained the map. Each day I returned to it, spreading the ancient parchment across the oak table, my magnifying glass a lens into the estate's obscured past. I meticulously cross-referenced the incomplete sections with old deeds and geological surveys, my cartographer's instincts guiding me. But the map. It was changing. At first, I attributed it to the variations in light, the subtle shifts in my own perception. It wasn't bold, not a definite feature, but a suggestion of one. I squinted, tracing the area with my finger. I knew I hadn't drawn it. My hand, steady and practiced, would never have left such an ambiguous mark. I dismissed it as a wrinkle in the aging paper, or perhaps a shadow cast by the uneven surface. But then, days later, as I was comparing a section near the forgotten root cellar, I saw it again. A cluster of minute symbols, almost like tiny, inverted triangles, had appeared near the edge of a wooded area marked old growth. They were not part of the original hand, nor were they mine. They were too precise, too uniform, yet undeniably new. My breath caught in my throat. I leaned closer, my heart beginning a slow, heavy drumbeat against my ribs. These were not random marks. They looked like glyphs. Ancient, unsettling. My rational mind, my meticulous, ordered world, began to fray at the edges. The map was smooth, cool beneath my touch, yet the symbols were undeniably there, etched into the very fibers of the paper as if by an unseen hand. The estate was not merely old and decaying. It was alive. It was a conduit. The house was not simply listening. It was communicating. And I, Reed, the cartographer, was beginning to understand its language. The shifting objects in the study had become a grotesque game, a silent, mocking testament to a presence I could no longer deny. The drafting pencil, once precisely aligned, now lay near the cold glass of the window, its metallic sheen dulled by the encroaching shadows. The stacked journals, their spines once a neat row of silent histories, were askew, as if a careless hand had rifled through them, seeking something specific. My determination, however, was a stubborn, gnarled root, digging deeper even as the soil around it turned to rot. I needed answers, not just for my own sanity, but to reclaim the very ground beneath my feet. The estate's forgotten library, a cavern of dust and hushed echoes, became my sanctuary and my prison. I began with the oldest, most brittle documents, the ones tucked away in neglected chests and bound in crumbling leather. The air, thick with the scent of decaying paper and forgotten wood smoke, settled in my lungs, a heavy, historical perfume. Initial entries were vague, oblique. A great-great-aunt's diary, its ink faded to sepia, spoke of the land's peculiar temperament, of difficulties with the soil that defy explanation, and the family's peculiar affliction, a melancholy that settles in the bones. I dismissed these as the melancholic musings of an isolated life. The cousin, writing from the estate, detailed a growing unnatural fixation with a section of the property near the western marsh, a place I had marked on my incomplete map as an area of unusual topographical dips and rises. His letters grew more frantic, describing whispers from the earth itself, and shadows that coalesce from the very air. The correspondence ceased abruptly, the last letter ending mid-sentence, the ink blotched as if the writer had been startled, or worse, interrupted. My search intensified, a desperate, feverish hunt. I unearthed a collection of journals from various ancestors, spanning nearly 2 centuries. Generations apart, these individuals, my blood kin, recounted strikingly similar experiences. One journal, penned by an ancestor named Elias, detailed the descent into paranoia, his elegant script devolving into frantic scrawls as he described the hunger beneath. His final entry was a single, stark sentence: "It requires the map, completed." My breath hitched. Elias, like me, had been a cartographer, albeit of a more rudimentary sort. His crude sketches, tucked within the journal's pages, depicted areas of the estate that precisely mirrored the unmarked sections of my map. The same strange formations, the same peculiar depressions. It wasn't just a coincidence, it was a pattern, a horrifying echo through time. The map wasn't merely a guide, it was a chronicle of their madness, or perhaps, the catalyst of it. The hours bled into days. Sleep became a luxury I could not afford, my mind a churning vortex of dates, names, and unsettling accounts. My eyes, gritty and red-rimmed, devoured every scrap of parchment. It detailed local folklore, tales passed down through generations of the village elders, speaking of the land's ancient claim, of the price exacted for settlement, demanding a tribute from the lineage that dared to claim its ground. The sheer weight of the repetition, the undeniable convergence of these disparate accounts, pressed down on me like a physical force. Each faded word, each brittle page, was a link in a chain that bound me to a terrible inheritance. The map was not just a historical document, it was a key, an invitation, perhaps even a trap. And I, Reed, with my cartographer's compulsion for completion, was walking directly into it. The need for a moment of stark, jarring normalcy became overwhelming. Rows of mannequins, frozen in their synthetic smiles, stared out from behind plate glass, their vacant eyes reflecting the harsh overhead lights. The air, cool and recycled, carried no scent of decay, only the faint, clean tang of disinfectant. I wandered aimlessly, the fluorescent hum of buzzing in my skull. Here, in this monument to commerce and fleeting desires, the reality of what I had uncovered felt even more monstrous. The mundane world continued, oblivious to the insidious horror I had unearthed. The contrast was a slap. My ancestors had faced this same insidious force, and I, the last of my line, was now tracing their steps, not merely as an observer, but as a participant. It wasn't just a guide to hidden features, it was a diagram of something malevolent, a diagram I was compelled to complete. The brittle parchment of Elias's journal felt impossibly cold beneath my fingertips, even in the humid air of the study. His crude, hurried lines, depicting those same strange formations, those peculiar depressions that scarred the unmarked territories of my map, seemed to writhe with a life of their own. A chilling resonance hummed between the two documents, a silent, dreadful conversation spanning generations. He had seen it too, or drawn it, or perhaps, both. They were no longer just a murmur of the old house settling, or the wind sighing through broken panes. They were a dry rustle, like forgotten leaves skittering across a stone floor, and they seemed to coalesce just beyond the reach of my ears, just at the periphery of my vision. I would glance up from the map, certain I'd caught a flicker of movement in the dust motes dancing in a stray shaft of light, or the brief, almost imperceptible sway of a heavy curtain where no breeze stirred. One evening, as I hunched over the drafting table, attempting to overlay Elias's sketches onto my own meticulous work, a faint scratching began. It wasn't the rhythmic gnawing of a mouse, but something lighter, more deliberate, like fingernails dragging across a rough wooden surface. It came from the wall directly behind me, then shifted, seemingly moving through the plaster, echoing in the space above the ceiling joists. My breath hitched. I spun around, my chair scraping loudly on the floorboards, but there was nothing. The next morning, I found the heavy brass inkwell, a family heirloom, overturned on the desk. I knew, with an unsettling certainty, that I had not left it that way. The faint, sweet smell of the ink, usually comforting, now carried a metallic tang, like old blood. Then, from the inky blackness, a voice, raspy and thin, seemed to unspool itself into the air. I scrambled backward, knocking over my chair, my gaze darting around the room, desperate for a source, a trick of the light, anything rational. But there was nothing. Only the suffocating quiet, and the lingering echo of that terrible word. The visions began to invade my waking hours, no longer confined to the murky depths of sleep. My eyes blurred, and the study, with its sagging bookshelves and the smell of aged paper, vanished. Suddenly, I was standing in a vast, echoing space, impossibly bright despite the lack of direct sunlight. The air hummed with a low, electrical thrum. The fluorescent tubes above cast a harsh, unwavering glare on polished floors that stretched into the distance, reflecting the empty storefronts. Their limbs were unnaturally rigid, their smiles fixed and unsettling. A faint, cloying scent, like artificial flowers and stale air conditioning, filled my nostrils. I could hear the distant, repetitive loop of an elevator chime, endlessly rising and falling through an invisible shaft. The utter emptiness of it all, the sheer scale of abandoned consumption, pressed in on me. I tried to move, but my legs felt rooted to the spot, a silent scream caught in my throat. Then, just as suddenly, the cold stone walls of the study solidified around me once more. My hands were gripping the edge of the drafting table so tightly my knuckles were white. The smell of dust and old paper filled my lungs. Had I truly been there? Or was it a new weapon in the entity's growing arsenal against my sanity? The landline, long dormant, crackled to life after several attempts. I called a colleague, a fellow cartographer who understood the intricate language of lines and contours. "Are you all right? You sound strained." His voice crackled, laced with concern, but also a hint of unease. "The isolation. It can play tricks on the mind." He offered to send some reference materials, to give me something else to focus on. He didn't understand. How could he? The line went dead with a soft click, severing my last thread to the outside world. I was alone, truly alone, within these walls, with a force that was no longer content to merely hint at its presence. It was here, it was aggressive, and it was beginning to speak my name, or rather, its claim over me. The estate, once my refuge, was becoming a cage, and the bars were tightening. That thrumming. A low, resonant vibration, a sound felt more than heard, that had seeped into the very marrow of my bones. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drum in the sudden silence. But there was nothing. Only the suffocating quiet, and the lingering echo of that monstrous, subterranean pulse. Panic, cold and sharp, had seized me then, a clawed hand gripping my throat. The estate's walls, once a comforting embrace of history, now felt like the crumbling confines of a tomb. By the time the first blush of dawn painted the eastern sky a sickly gray, I was already in my vehicle, the old sedan rumbling away from the estate's gates. My destination, though incongruous, was driven by a desperate, half-formed thought, a specialty art supply store, nestled within the sprawling architecture of the town's main commercial hub. The vast parking lot, usually a churning sea of metal and hurried footsteps, lay utterly deserted. My tires crunched softly on scattered gravel, the only sound for miles. Above me, the skeletal framework of the mall's exterior glowed with an indifferent, sterile luminescence. The air inside was cool, recycled, carrying the faint, ghost-like scent of forgotten perfumes and cleaning agents. The gate was open, a sign taped to its mesh declaring specialist orders by appointment. I had arranged this brief, solitary visit with the proprietor, a taciturn individual who had merely left the main mall doors unlocked for me. He was not present, which suited my solitary quest perfectly. Inside the store, the shelves stretched upwards, filled with a dizzying array of pigments, brushes, and papers. I moved with purpose towards the archival papers section, my fingers brushing against various textures, rough, smooth, fibrous, until I found the vellum I sought. It possessed a translucent quality, a subtle parchment-like sheen that I felt, instinctively, was critical. I laid the journal and the map section out on a wide, empty counter, a harsh overhead light illuminating every minute detail. The journal, which I had only recently begun to truly decipher, spoke in an archaic hand, its entries fragmented, poetic, and increasingly frantic. It chronicled the efforts of one of my ancestors, a surveyor named Alistair, who had meticulously documented the land's features long before the main house was even a concept. His later entries, however, veered wildly, describing the deep resonance, the sleeping titan beneath the loam, and the weakening of the stone. My gaze flitted between Alistair's frantic script and the map section. The map itself was a topographical marvel, but certain symbols, previously dismissed as stylistic flourishes or incomplete notations, now snagged my attention. They were not topographical markers at all. They were repetitions of a stylized sigil, a jagged, almost claw-like emblem, always positioned around a central, unlabeled depression on the map. With a deep, shaky breath, I took a magnifying glass from a display stand. I focused on the sigils, then on Alistair's journal. His final, almost illegible entry, scrawled across 2 pages, mentioned the seals of the old blood, and the prison of the Earthheart. He wrote of the binding, woven into the very bedrock by those who came before, and of the growing fissure, the slow, relentless hum of its awakening. The pieces, like fragments of shattered glass, began to click into a terrible mosaic. The map was not a guide to a hidden vault or a forgotten treasure. The central depression was not a sinkhole, but the very apex of this ancient confinement, a place where something immense, something primordial and unknowable, lay dormant. And the symbols, the jagged, claw-like emblems, were the seals, anchors holding the unspeakable captive. Alistair's frantic notes, the map's cryptic lines, the unsettling sounds I had heard back at the estate, they were all warnings. The thing he spoke of, the Earthheart, was not merely a geological phenomenon. It was an entity, a force of profound malevolence, buried beneath the land, and its prison was weakening. The deep resonance Alistair had heard, the low thrumming I had felt in the floorboards, the guttural sound that had driven me from the estate, these were not tricks of the mind or the house's age. They were the vibrations of something stirring, something immense pressing against its ancient bonds. And I, Reed, a cartographer obsessed with lines and contours, had been drawn here. Not by chance, not by mere inheritance. The journal spoke of a lineage, of the blood that hears the hum. My forebears had been the keepers, the watchers, perhaps even the constructors of this terrible seal. And now, the responsibility had fallen to me. The map was incomplete, yes, but not because a section was missing. It was incomplete because I was meant to complete it, to reinforce the failing containment, to draw the final, binding lines. Or, perhaps, to inadvertently finish the job of its undoing, to open the door entirely. The map lay before me, no longer a puzzle, but a terrifying burden. I was not merely exploring an ancestral estate, I was standing on the precipice of an ancient, terrible duty, or a catastrophic release. The choice, I knew with a sickening lurch, would soon be mine. The map, that terrible, beautiful lie had pulsed in my mind for hours, a phantom ache behind my eyes. Its lines, once confined to the boundaries of the estate, now seemed to stretch, thin tendrils of ancient geometry reaching into the sprawling, indifferent city. A compulsion, cold and insistent, had seized me. Find it there. The missing piece. The key. It was a whisper that wasn't a sound, a certainty that wasn't my own thought, guiding my trembling hands to the car keys, pulling me through the night. The automatic doors slid open with a soft, pneumatic sigh, exhaling recycled air that carried ghost scents, a lingering sweetness of perfume, the faint, greasy memory of popcorn, the sharp tang of disinfectant. The vast space stretched before me, a cathedral of commerce stripped of its worshippers. Their plastic forms, draped in fabric, were unsettlingly lifelike, yet utterly devoid of warmth. The air grew heavy, thick with an unspoken presence. It clung to me like a shroud, raising gooseflesh on my arms despite the cool, conditioned atmosphere. Then it began. Not a sound from the mall itself, but a resonance within my own skull. The reflections in the polished floors began to ripple, subtly at first, then more pronounced, distorting my image into something long and gaunt, a stranger with haunted eyes. It was not a voice I heard with my ears, but a concept, fully formed, blooming in the silent chambers of my consciousness. Your ancestors sought to bind what cannot be bound. They were fools. Weak. A shiver raked my spine. This was it. The entity. It was not merely influencing me, it was speaking to me, bypassing my senses, burrowing directly into my thoughts. You carry the burden. The blood remembers. Release me, read. End the struggle. The knowledge you crave, the peace you seek. It is mine to give. The words were honeyed, yet laced with an unbearable pressure, a psychic weight that threatened to crush my skull. A new compulsion arose, stronger than the last. It tugged me, physically almost, towards a service corridor I hadn't noticed before, tucked away behind the food court, between a closed pretzel stand and a defunct arcade. The light here was dimmer, flickering weakly, the hum of the fluorescence replaced by an irregular buzz. The entity's voice intensified, a relentless torrent in my mind. This way, little cartographer. See the truth. See the folly of their bindings. I pushed open a heavy, unmarked door. It groaned on rusty hinges, revealing a storage space, a graveyard of discarded retail dreams. Dusty mannequins lay headless in piles, their plastic limbs askew. Christmas decorations from a forgotten season hung limply from hooks. The scent of dust and mildew was overwhelming, a counterpoint to the mall's artificial freshness. And there, amidst the detritus, on a low shelf overflowing with broken display props, lay a book. It was old, impossibly old, its leather cover cracked and flaking, its pages yellowed and brittle. It looked utterly out of place, an anachronism in this temple of consumerism. My hand, guided by an invisible force, reached for it. The book fell open to a page filled with crude, unsettling drawings. Symbols I recognized from the estate map, but rendered with a frantic, desperate energy. Below them, tightly scrawled script, faded but legible, detailed a ritual. It wasn't a summoning, but a resealing. A binding. My ancestors, it seemed, had left a desperate last resort. The text spoke of the heart of the land, a malevolent presence that had long festered beneath the estate, tied to the very bloodline that now ran through my veins. It described the map not as a prison, but as a diagram of the lock, and the central depression as the ultimate point of containment, the capstone. The ritual was complex, involving specific alignments, forgotten incantations, and a profound act of will. The sacrifice of memory. The guardian becomes the blank slate. It was not a sacrifice of blood, but of identity. To reseal the entity, to ensure its eternal slumber, I would have to strip myself bare, erase the very essence of Reed, the meticulous cartographer, the inheritor of a cursed lineage. A profound, irreversible lobotomy of the soul. Foolish, foolish ritual, the entity hissed in my mind, its voice now laced with a raw, ancient fury. They feared me. You cannot succeed. You cannot unmake yourself. Submit, Reed. Become one with me. Embrace the power your ancestors denied themselves. My lineage had contained this horror for generations, and now, the final, desperate act fell to me. To become nothing, or to unleash everything. The fate of the land, and perhaps beyond, hinged on my choice. The air in the deserted mall crackled with a silent, terrible demand. No longer was this a matter of ancestral legacy or a crumbling estate. The stakes, like shards of shattered glass, had become terrifyingly clear. The book spoke of the entity's true hunger, its reach extending far beyond the confines of the land, threatening to unravel the very fabric of existence. I understood then, with a dreadful certainty, that I was the last bulwark. The ritual, desperate and perilous, was my only course. I moved with a grim, almost ritualistic precision through the echoing halls of the manor. A fragment of the map, the one I had so meticulously, foolishly, sought to complete. Now, I knew it to be a warning. Behind a crumbling fireplace in the disused servants' wing, a loose stone yielded to my desperate prying, revealing a passage that swallowed the meager light of my lantern. I descended into the maw, each step on the rough-hewn stone steps a commitment to the inevitable. The air grew heavier, pressing against my chest, making each breath a conscious effort. My senses reeled. The air, instead of earth and decay, smelled faintly of stale popcorn and chemical cleaning agents, a cloying, sickly sweet fragrance. This was a trick, a cruel illusion woven by the entity to disorient me, to tempt me with a false reality. I spun around, searching for the entrance to the passage, but there was only a display of mannequins, their vacant eyes staring into the middle distance, their plastic smiles fixed in mocking. A distant, tinny music, barely audible, seemed to drift from an unseen speaker, a warped echo of some forgotten pop song. This was not real. This was a cage of light and manufactured normalcy. I closed my eyes, forcing the image away, concentrating on the feel of the stone, the smell of the earth. The entity was trying to offer me an escape, a delusion of safety, or perhaps simply to break my mind before I reached its core. I could hear phantom footsteps echoing on the polished floor, coming from nowhere, going nowhere. A sudden blast of cold air, like a breath from a giant, swept through the empty concourse, rattling the metal security gates of the closed shops. I opened my eyes, the mall still there, but now shimmering at the edges, less solid. My vision blurred, and for a terrifying instant, the mannequins in the shop windows seemed to turn their heads, their plastic faces contorting into silent screams. I gripped the iron dagger in my hand, its rough handle a grounding reality. I pushed forward, not caring where, just forward, through the illusory concourse, my eyes fixed on an imagined point beyond the false reality. The hum of the lights grew unbearable, a buzzing agony in my skull. Then, with a jolt that rattled my teeth, the illusion shattered. I stumbled, my boot finding purchase on rough, wet stone once more. The cloying smell of the mall vanished, replaced by the familiar, fetid breath of the deep earth. My lantern, which I realized I still held, cast its weak glow onto a narrow, dripping tunnel. The entity's assault had failed, but it had left its mark. My head throbbed, and a phantom ache resonated behind my eyes. The passage narrowed further, forcing me to stoop, my back scraping against the jagged ceiling. The air grew thick, stagnant, carrying a new scent now, a metallic tang, like old blood, interwoven with something ancient and indescribably foul. The walls began to change, no longer mere rock, but carved with crude, unsettling symbols that seemed to writhe in the lantern light. They were not human, not animal, but something else entirely, a language of pain and hunger. A low growl rumbled from the depths ahead, not of an animal, but a sound that vibrated through the very stone, settling deep in my chest. Pebbles dislodged from the ceiling, raining down around me, sharp and stinging. A section of the passage ahead seemed to sag, a massive, uneven slab of rock dropping to block my path, as if the very earth itself sought to deny me entry. But I would not be deterred. This was the entity's last, desperate attempt. With a surge of adrenaline, I squeezed through a narrow fissure at the side of the fallen rock, scraping skin from my arms and shoulder. The passage opened then, into a vast, cavernous space. The air here was heavy, alive with a malevolent presence that prickled my skin. My lantern beam struggled to penetrate the gloom, revealing only a fraction of the immense chamber, but enough to see the central altar, a rough-hewn stone monolith, slick with what I desperately hoped was only dampness. This was it. The heart of the corruption. The place of sacrifice. And I, Reed, had arrived. Failure meant not just that. Fluorescent tubes cast a pale, sickly glow across polished floors, reflecting the empty storefronts like so many vacant eyes. The map, now a sacred, terrifying blueprint, had led me here, to this sterile temple of commerce, a place so utterly devoid of the ancient earth I had come to understand. Yet, the final, cryptic markings had been undeniable, a convergence point, a nexus of unseen lines of power, nestled within the grid of this modern labyrinth. I found the precise spot, marked by the intersection of four main walkways, directly beneath a colossal, dormant skylight. Here, the hum of the lights seemed to intensify, vibrating in my teeth, a silent scream. The air grew heavy, thick with an unseen dust that tasted of decay and stale ozone. My cartographers, I saw the invisible lines, the geometric precision of the structure, and understood how it mirrored the ancient patterns etched into the estate's land, a conduit for something that had slumbered for centuries. With trembling hands, I retrieved the chalk. I began to draw, the symbols from the forbidden text blooming under my hand, intricate sigils, interlocking geometries, a containment field designed to shackle the uncontainable. Each line was a prayer, each curve a plea. The lights above flickered, a stroboscopic assault on my vision. The vast, empty space around me seemed to stretch, the distant storefronts receding into an impossible distance. You tread on ground not your own. You disturb what cannot be bound. It was a voice without a tongue, a weight without a body, crushing my resolve. My hands shook, but I forced them steady, focusing on the next segment of the ritual. I placed the compass at the center of the nascent diagram, its needle now spinning not wildly, but with a frantic, desperate energy, as if trying to flee the impending confrontation. The entity's assault escalated. The mall's pristine surfaces began to ripple, reflections in the glass distorting into grotesque caricatures of myself. You are weak. You are a flicker. We are eternal. I pressed on, my cartographer's mind, usually so precise and logical, now a battleground. I remembered the map, the lines of resistance, the points of leverage. This wasn't just a physical ritual, it was a mental one, a mapping of will against an older, vaster intelligence. I chanted the words from the text, not aloud, but internally, a silent invocation, each syllable a brick in the wall I was building. Memories flashed, not my own, but fragments of ancient horrors, of sacrifices under moonless skies, of a world before reason, before light. The entity was trying to overwhelm me, to break my focus, to drown me in its boundless despair. My knees threatened to buckle, my vision blurred, the precise lines of my diagram wavering before my eyes. But I saw it, in the midst of the chaos, a specific node on the map, a point of confluence, a weakness. My cartographic training, my meticulous attention to detail, became my shield. I visualized the lines, the vectors of power, the exact angles of containment. I channeled every ounce of my will, every fragment of my ancestral memory, into the final stroke, the closing arc of the ritual diagram. As the chalk completed the final symbol, a deafening crack echoed through the mall, not a sound, but a tearing in the very air. The flickering lights stabilized, then dimmed to a sickly, unnatural orange. I stood, swaying, my body drained, my mind a ravaged landscape. The entity was gone. Or, rather, it was contained, bound within the intricate web of my cartographic ritual. I had contained the ancient evil, but at the cost of a piece of my own soul, leaving me adrift in a world whose coordinates I could no longer fully grasp. The fluorescent hum was the first thing. A high, thin whine that vibrated not just in my ears, but in the very bones of my skull, a stark counterpoint to the profound, ringing silence that had followed the final, tearing screech. The vast, polished floor stretched before me, a mirror reflecting the relentless rows of recessed lights. Storefronts, glass-eyed and vacant, stared out from either side, their mannequins frozen in poses of perpetual, unseeing grace. My body was a canvas of aching protest. Every muscle shrieked, every joint throbbed with a dull, persistent ache. My tongue felt thick, a dry, rasping thing in a mouth that tasted of dust and something metallic, something that might have been iron or old fear. I tried to push myself up, a groan escaping my lips, raw and foreign. My fingers, scraped and caked with dried earth, slipped on the smooth, unforgiving tile. I was slumped against a cold, decorative planter filled with plastic ferns, a grotesque parody of life. This silence was artificial, a manufactured void, broken only by the incessant hum of the lights and the distant, almost imperceptible thrum of unseen machinery. A deep gash scored my forearm, a jagged crimson line against pale skin, partially clotted but still weeping sluggishly. My head pounded, a drumbeat against the inside of my temples, and when I gingerly touched my scalp, my fingers came away sticky. Memory, fragmented and brutal, flickered at the edges of my awareness. The earth, tearing itself open. The words, chanted until my throat was raw, until my will was a thin, stretched wire. The resistance. The force, immense and crushing, that had pushed back, threatening to dissolve me into nothingness. And then, the sudden, terrible emptiness. It was gone. I knew that much, with a certainty that resonated deep within my marrow. The malevolent presence, the thing that had festered beneath the land, the ancient hunger tied to my lineage, it was gone. Vanished. Receded. I managed to push myself to a sitting position, my back against the planter. My gaze drifted across the deserted concourse, past the brightly lit but empty food court, to the distant, locked glass doors that led to the outside. How had I arrived here? The estate, my ancestral home, my sanctuary and my torment, felt impossibly far away, a place existing now only in the fractured landscape of my mind. Had I walked? Driven? There was no memory of transition, no journey. Only the fight, then this. The entity might be gone, but it hadn't left me untouched. I felt different. Not just the physical scars, the deep exhaustion that seemed to have settled permanently into my bones. There was a subtle shift in my perception, a new layer to the world. It was as if a veil had been torn, allowing me to glimpse the raw, vibrating edges of reality, the hidden currents beneath the mundane. A sliver of understanding, a shard of its vast, ancient knowledge embedded within my own consciousness. The lines were no longer clean, the boundaries blurred. I saw patterns where none should exist, felt connections that defied logic. The world outside remained oblivious. The cars that would pass on the highway, the people who would wake in their beds, the morning sun that would soon rise, they would know nothing of the ancient horror that had been unleashed, nothing of the desperate struggle that had taken place. My estate, I pictured it now, a ruin, a testament to the battle, scarred and broken, just as I was. It was a secret, a nightmare known only to me, and to the lingering echo within. I was alone, irrevocably changed, a survivor of a war no one else had witnessed. The fluorescent hum was the first thing. Now, it was a different hum. The air, thick with the ghost of disinfectant and stale popcorn, felt unnaturally still, as if the very molecules had held their breath since the last customer departed. My footsteps, usually a soft scuff, echoed with an almost aggressive clarity against the unyielding surfaces, each sound magnifying the vast emptiness around me. I moved without purpose, a ghost among mannequins. My hands, once steady instruments of precision, now harbored a faint, persistent tremor, a subtle vibration that thrummed just beneath the skin, a constant reminder. The cartography tools, the delicate pens. The fine rulers, they lay unused, gathering a thin film of dust in the study I had not touched in weeks. Weeks or months. Time had become a fluid, indistinct thing, its edges blurred by the profound shift that had occurred beneath the earth, beneath me star. Yet, the knowledge it had bequeathed me was sharper than any nightmare. I knew what lay buried. I knew the ancient, patient hunger that had stirred. And I knew the price. A cold, metallic taste coated my tongue, a phantom echo of the copper tang that had filled the air in those final, desperate moments. I ran a fingertip along the smooth, cool glass of a display window, the reflection staring back at me unfamiliar. The lines around them were etched deeper, not by age, but by vigilance. By the constant, low thrum of awareness that never truly receded. I had come here, to this sterile cathedral of commerce, seeking a semblance of normalcy. To buy. What? A new shirt? Groceries? The mundane necessities that once anchored my days now seemed utterly trivial, absurd even, against the backdrop of what I carried within me. The fluorescent light, harsh and unforgiving, stripped the world of its comforting illusions, revealing only stark lines and artificiality. The world had not changed, not for others. But for me, it was irrevocably altered. I saw the hidden seams, the fragile veneer that held reality together, and I knew what clawed beneath. The entity. I still couldn't bring myself to name it, to give it more power than it already possessed. The screech had ended, yes. The immediate threat, the escalating madness, had receded. But it was not gone. It was merely contained. And I was the container. I stopped before a sporting goods store, its mannequins frozen in athletic poses, their plastic smiles mocking. I saw the glint of a hunting knife, its blade catching the artificial light, and a shiver traced its way down my spine. Not for protection, no, for something else. A grim responsibility. The final act had been the sealing of the bargain. I had offered something, not of my flesh, but of my future. A dedication. A vigilance. The map, the incomplete, maddening map, had become not a puzzle to solve, but a burden to bear. I had completed it, yes, not with ink and parchment, but with a terrible understanding. The lines, the symbols, they were not just markers of geography, but conduits of influence. The true discovery was that I was not free. Not truly. The horror had not been vanquished, it had been integrated. I was no longer merely a cartographer, I was a custodian. A sentinel. The estate, no longer just an inheritance, was a vault, and I, its perpetual guard. The distant whir of an air conditioning unit was the only other sound besides the incessant hum. My reflection in the glass was distorted, elongated, a stranger peering back from a watery depth. The scent of loam and something ancient, metallic. Always the hum. Now, the hum of the mall lights was a constant companion, a reminder. It was a different pitch, a softer frequency, but it resonated with the same unnerving vibration within my bones. It was the sound of the world continuing, oblivious, while I carried the weight of what lay beneath. There would be no return to the life I once knew. The meticulous precision, the quiet dedication to historical maps, that man was gone. In his place stood someone else, someone whose gaze lingered too long on cracks in pavement, whose ears strained for echoes in the wind, whose every fiber was attuned to the subtle shifts in the earth beneath his feet. But the price was a perpetual tether. My future was not one of peace, but of eternal vigilance, a silent guardianship against a horror that was contained, but never truly over.